So I'm trying a few new things with this newest set of videos. So here is our first video for the new updated curriculum for AP Biology. And we're going to be talking about not only the structure of water, but hydrogen bonding, which is going to come back to haunt us quite a bit. So water is a really big deal when we're talking about life. Water has a lot of unique properties that make life as we know it possible. In fact, that's why when we look for life on other planets, the first thing we do is we look for evidence of water, especially liquid water. And water has some particular properties that make it unique and make it ideal for supporting life as we know it. And a lot of this is based on the structure of water itself, the properties of the atoms that make it up. So we know water is H2O. And the hydrogens and the oxygen are connected by a covalent bond. It is covalent, but it is a polar covalent bond. And that is because oxygen is a very electronegative atom, by which I mean it strongly attracts electrons. And so this is the oxygen, these are the hydrogens. So what ends up happening is oxygen will I tend to personify molecules and atoms, so oxygen will kind of grab on more tightly to the electrons that it's sharing with the hydrogens, and so the electrons will spend more time around the oxygen than around the hydrogens, giving the oxygen a slight negative charge, a partial negative charge, and occasionally you'll see it represented like this, which is a lowercase delta. It's not important to know what it is, just to know if you see that, it's a partial charge, and the negative sign indicates that it's negative. Then since the electrons that hydrogen would normally have are not found around the hydrogens as much, they tend to have a slight positive charge because the electrons that they're sharing are not spending as much time in the vicinity of the hydrogen ion. We say that this is a polar covalent bond because while it's sharing electrons, it's not sharing them equally. So this results in something called hydrogen bonding, and this is due to the fact that these molecules with their polarity have these partial charges, which makes them act almost like tiny magnets. And hopefully you at least have played with magnets enough to know that positive charges and negative charges are going to be attracted to each other. And so these opposite charges, the attraction between them ends up being called a hydrogen bond. So hydrogen bonds are going to play an important role in the 3D structure of a lot of the biomolecules and macromolecules that we're going to talk about. And understanding how these hydrogen bonds help contribute to that 3D structure helps us figure out some of the properties of like proteins and DNA and things like that. That's going to make it easier to understand them. So we have these three water molecules pictured here, and I do always have the charges, the partial charges, so that you can see them. And notice that I've now added in some bonds between the positive, the slightly positive hydrogen of one water molecule and the slightly negative oxygen of another water molecule. These are the hydrogen bonds, and they are relatively weak. They're not as strong as, say, the bond between full ions, but if you actually put a bunch of hydrogen bonds together, they can form a much stronger connection between molecules or parts of a molecule and then hold those together. So hopefully you remember from freshman biology that you have nitrogenous bases in the center of DNA, and they are held together by hydrogen bonds. So the only thing that's holding together your two strands of DNA is not a very strong covalent bond. It's not a strong ionic bond. It's hundreds or thousands of these weak hydrogen bonds. But each of these small weak bonds, the strength of them adds up to enough force to keep those molecules together. When we talk about the three-dimensional structure of proteins, we'll learn that there are these characteristic shapes that are formed called alpha helices and beta sheets, and these contribute to the 3D structure of proteins, and they are formed almost entirely by hydrogen bonds that helps keep that 3D structure of proteins. So let's say we have a bunch of water molecules floating around. Keep in mind, this is a liquid. And so also keep in mind that this is a two-dimensional representation of what would be three-dimensional water. But notice I have oriented most of these water molecules to try to keep positive hydrogen areas near negative oxygen areas. So I'm drawing in some of these hydrogen bonds, and I know it's not a perfect alignment. For example, here I have positive hydrogens facing each other, but keep in mind this is liquid water, so things are constantly in motion. You've got hydrogen bonds being formed and broken all the time. Where this becomes of some significance is if you have something like a polar molecule like this green molecule here. Notice that I have the positive hydrogen areas facing the negative part of this molecule, and I have the negative oxygen areas facing the positive part of this molecule because they have a slight electrical attraction between them. So notice that water mixes with other polar molecules. Now, what happens if I put some ions in here? Well, if I put some ions in here, like I have a sodium ion over here in the nice purple one, and I have a chloride ion on the left, that I have this negatively charged chloride ion, and I have these positively charged segments of the water molecule facing it. So they will interact strongly with ions. Then notice that I have the slightly negative parts of the oxygen facing the positively charged sodium. So you'll notice that water mixes with ions as well. But when I have a nonpolar molecule, I have kind of set it off to the side because water will tend to form these hydrogen bonds with other water molecules. It'll form these, they're not quite hydrogen bonds, but it'll form this kind of electrical attraction to these ions. And since it is doing that with with all the charged molecules, it excludes the nonpolar molecules. So if you think about oil and water, how they don't mix, that's because the water is so attracted to other water molecules, it basically excludes the oil molecules. All right, so that's important to remember with polar and nonpolar molecules because that takes us into hydrophobic and hydrophilic, which are terms that describe polar and nonpolar molecules just in terms of how they interact with water. So hydrophilic means that it's basically something that will mix well with water, and these are charged or polar molecules. Hopefully you can remember this by remembering philos means love, so it literally means water loving. If you don't remember what philos means, it's Philadelphia literally means the city of brotherly love. That's where the philos comes from. So water's ability to dissolve so many different substances makes it what we call the universal solvent. So water's ability to dissolve a wide range of chemicals makes it a very unique solution or solvent that allows a bunch of stuff to dissolve in it. And we are all basically complex solutions of water with a bunch of stuff dissolved in it. There are hydrophobic molecules. These are nonpolar and uncharged molecules that are not going to be able to mix well with water, so they do not mix in an aqueous solution, which is a watery solution. Basically, it's anything dissolved in water. And you might remember phobic or phobia means fear, so literally that word means water-fearing. And this, the biggest example of this are lipids, which are that class of biomolecules that do not mix with water. In fact, that's what we use to define them, the fact that they don't mix with water. So some of the properties that develop from this polarity and how water interacts with itself are going to be really important to life and its function. So water has something called a high specific heat capacity. Specific heat is basically how much heat energy you have to add to something to change its temperature. And this is really high for water compared to other substances. This means that water can absorb a lot of heat before it changes temperature, and it can release a lot of heat for changing temperature. This is because of all these hydrogen bonds that are in between the water molecules, and so it lets a solution of water absorb a lot of energy before it actually changes the temperature or release a lot of energy. And so for a few things about this, one, bodies of water like lakes, rivers, and the ocean don't change temperatures dramatically. And since we are very heavily composed of water, it also allows us to maintain our homeostasis of our body temperature without having to spend as much energy to keep the temperature at the same level. So yes, as warm-blooded animals, we do use some of our energy that we take in, a decent amount of it, it to raise our body temperature and keep it at that constant temperature, but it would take even more energy if water didn't have this high specific heat capacity. Water also has a high heat of vaporization, so to make it evaporate. This is the amount of energy you need to evaporate a liquid. If you've ever had like rubbing alcohol and you've left the cap off of the bottle, or you've poured it out into a container and just kind of let it sit out, that stuff evaporates really easily, and it evaporates at room temperature. You leave it out and 10 minutes later you come back, half of it might be evaporated. If you do the same thing to water at room temperature, it's going to take it a lot longer to evaporate. That's why it takes plenty of energy to boil water or to boil water and make steam. So again, this is something that's high for water. Again, it has to do with the hydrogen bonding, but this is particularly useful because it allows organisms to use sweat and other liquids evaporating off the surface of the skin to evaporatively cool skin, which lets us maintain homeostasis a lot easier. So that's why sweating actually cools you down, because it uses a lot of energy, heat energy from your skin. So there are a couple of other properties of water that are due to hydrogen bonding that have to do with its stickiness, is what I think of it as. So there is cohesion, which I like this diagram here because it's showing you two water molecules kind of holding hands. That attraction between two water molecules is called cohesion. So that's going to cause water to kind of bead up. If you spill water on a table, or when we're doing the penny lab in class, you'll notice water tends to stay clumped up, and that's due to cohesion. There's also adhesion, which I like this diagram because it also shows adhesion right here, where water molecules are attracted to other things. Now remember, those are going to be the polar and charged molecules, but this also allows water to stick to other things, which is important for something called capillary action. And we'll talk about that a little more when we talk about some transport, cell transport. There's also the property of surface tension. So that's due to cohesion. So water molecules stick together, and that forms this kind of skin that you see on the surface of water, like what you see here. Like that's why water beads up to form water droplets, and it sticks together as a drop. You'll notice that basically these hydrogen bonds that water is trying to make with as many other water molecules as possible kind of force it to stick together. Water molecules also, because of this electronegativity of oxygen, can actually break apart, and this is called dissociation, or they dissociate. So oxygen is so electronegative that on some occasions it will actually strip the electron from a hydrogen, and then it will break into two ions. That is a hydrogen ion, which is sometimes called a proton because it is basically a naked proton. It's a nucleus without any electrons. So we'll talk about proton pumps later, which are going to be important. And then hydroxide ions, which are OHs. And then this is a reversible reaction. I'll talk about that a little more in a second, meaning that these hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions can then recombine to form water. But because this happens spontaneously, even if you have pure water that has a pH of 7, there are always going to be some hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions floating around in the water. And that's important because of pH. So pH is a measurement of how many hydrogen ions are in a solution. And you should have become familiar with the pH scale in chemistry. It goes from 0 to 14. 0 to 7 is acidic. As you get farther away from 7, which hopefully you remember is neutral. As you get farther away from neutral, you get either a stronger acid if you're going towards 0, or a stronger base if you're going towards 14. So substances that are acids essentially just increase the hydrogen ion concentration. Substances that are bases either reduce the hydrogen ion concentration or they increase the hydroxide ion concentration. This is important because pH is going to play a role in the structure of molecules. So you hopefully learned about denaturing proteins in freshman biology, and that can happen when you have the wrong pH, because if you have the wrong pH, then you're going to have a different concentration of hydrogen ions, which can mess with the hydrogen bonding that helps a protein have its 3D shape. So pH is going to be really important. So reactions can be reversible. So if you have like a reaction like what you see here, this is N2O4 that can break down into two NO2s. I'm just using this as an example. This is not a reaction we need to really care about. Notice the opposite reaction can happen as well, going from those two NO2s back to N2O4. So for shorthand, we can actually write this equation with these two arrow symbols, which means that the equation is reversible, meaning it can proceed in either direction. And then that's usually which direction that reaction goes in is going to depend on how much of each of these chemicals you have. So for instance, if we took away, if we had this reaction that's happening, this reversible reaction, and we started taking away the N2O4, then that means this reaction will more be driven towards making N2O4. If we take out the NO2, then the reaction would be driven back in the opposite direction, and we would start making more NO2. And this can happen spontaneously without any energy or enzymes involved. And this is important for something called buffers. So buffers are these systems that exist in cells and blood and various things that will let a system resist changes in pH without having to use any energy. So this kind of happens spontaneously due to the nature of acids and bases and stuff like that. So this is a good way to not use energy, but to still maintain homeostasis and keep your pH at a specific value, which lets make sure your enzymes are functioning properly and that all the chemical reactions that need to happen can happen. Your biomolecules are all in stable formation. Usually you'll have a weak acid and a base that is kind of like the counterpart to that acid, and this reaction will go back and forth. So for instance, if you ended up having a lot of hydrogen ions build up somewhere, the reaction would then be driven towards the left, and you'd start forming a lot more carbonic acid, which would take up those hydrogen ions and would start making the solution's pH start rising. So that way it becomes less acidic. And then this is a really common buffer system in cells with carbonic acid and bicarbonate. You do not need to memorize this equation. You do not need to memorize the names of these molecules. I just wanted to go ahead and show you this because it is something that can show up on AP tests. But more importantly, if you go into medicine or biochemistry, it's something that you're going to see again. So that is the end of water, and we will definitely talk about it again, but this should be a foundational lesson for you.